Regional Victoria added more than 41,000 new residents in a single year. Not Melbourne. Regional Victoria. Towns like Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, and Shepparton are absorbing people at a rate the infrastructure wasn't built for, the planning systems weren't designed for, and here's the part nobody talks about: the land market hasn't fully priced in yet. There is a window open right now in regional Victorian land that looks from the outside like a sleepy backwater. From the inside, it looks like 2012 Brisbane. The question is whether you see it before the money from Collins Street does. Most people who think about regional Victorian property think about one thing: houses. Buy a house in Ballarat, rent it out, collect yield. That's the conversation. And look, it's not a bad conversation. Rental yields in regional Victoria are running at 4 to 6% in a lot of areas, which is better than you'll get in most Melbourne suburbs where you're lucky to clear 3. But that's not the interesting conversation. The interesting conversation is land. Raw land, rural land, blocks that don't have a house on them, don't have a tenant in them, and don't show up on the radar of the average buyer's agent who's still running seminars about the inner west. Here's where most people go wrong. They assume rural land is complicated, illiquid, or only for farmers. They assume the banks won't touch it. They assume it just sits there doing nothing. All of those assumptions are worth examining because none of them are entirely true in 2026, and some of them are flat out wrong. Let's start with what's actually happening in regional Victoria right now, because the situation on the ground has shifted significantly in the last 2 years. Victoria's housing statement, the one the state government released with enormous fanfare, is doing something interesting to regional areas. The primary focus was on Melbourne density. Knock down the old stuff, build more apartments, free up land near train stations. Fine. But the downstream effect on regional zones has been quietly significant. Councils that used to wave through rural residential rezonings are now getting more scrutiny from the state. At the same time, population pressure in regional cities is pushing development demand outward into peri-urban land, the stuff on the edges of town that's still zoned rural but is functionally sitting next to suburban subdivisions. What that creates is a pincer. You've got increasing demand for residential land on one side. You've got state-level planning complexity on the other. And caught in the middle are landowners and prospective buyers who can see the opportunity but can't quite figure out how to navigate the system. Quick note: this episode contains affiliate links. If you sign up to any product mentioned via our show notes link, Hidden Yield may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. We only mention products we genuinely use or believe in. If regional Victorian land is something you want to go deeper on, the Developer Network is worth a look. It's one of Australia's most practical property development communities, with real deal analysis and education for people who want to move beyond just buying a house. Link in the show notes. That's the gap. And gaps are where yield lives. So what does this actually look like in practice? Let's walk through 4 specific things worth understanding if you're looking at regional Victorian land right now. First, zoning is not destiny, but it matters enormously, and most people don't read it properly. Victoria uses a planning zone system administered by local councils, but overlaid by state policy. The key zones for rural land are farming zone, rural living zone, rural conservation zone, and green wedge zone. These are not interchangeable. A block in a farming zone has completely different development potential to a block in a rural living zone, and the difference can mean hundreds of thousands of dollars in underlying value. Rural living zone, for example, typically allows residential use on smaller lots, sometimes as small as 2 hectares, without needing a full planning permit for a dwelling. Farming zone often requires a permit, and that permit comes with conditions that can make a dwelling effectively impossible unless the agricultural use case is genuine. If you're buying rural land and you haven't had a town planner look at the zone and overlay before you sign anything, you're flying blind. Overlays matter just as much as the zone itself. Bushfire management overlays, erosion management overlays, significant landscape overlays. Each one limits what you can do and adds cost to doing it. A block in the Macedon Ranges might be zoned rural living but sit under a significant landscape overlay. That means any dwelling design needs to meet criteria that will add $50,000 to $100,000 to your build. That doesn't make it a bad buy. It makes it a buy you need to understand before you make it. Second, the councils that are actually saying yes. Not every council in regional Victoria has the same approach to rural residential applications. This matters because if you're buying land with any intention of getting a planning permit, whether for a dwelling, a subdivision, or a change of use, the council's culture and workload affects your timeline and your risk profile enormously. Councils like Greater Bendigo and Greater Shepparton are dealing with serious population pressure and have been working through planning scheme amendments that open up more land. Councils in areas like Hepburn Shire or Macedon Ranges are significantly more conservative. They have strong community sentiment around landscape protection, and they have the planning policy backing to act on it. Neither is better or worse. They're just different. And buying land without knowing which environment you're operating in is like buying a property without knowing the local flood history. The interesting ones to watch right now are councils in the corridor between Ballarat and Geelong, and in parts of the Loddon Mallee region around Castlemaine and Maldon. Population growth is putting pressure on housing supply, infrastructure is being upgraded, and the planning discussions around future residential land supply are actively in progress. That is the signal, not the completed rezoning, the in-progress discussion. Third, what banks will and won't do, and why it matters less than you think. Yes, banks are harder on rural land than residential. If you go to a major bank and say you want to buy a 40-hectare block with no dwelling, they will make your life difficult. Loan-to-value ratios drop, sometimes to 50 or 60%. Some won't lend at all unless there's an existing dwelling. The standard answer from a broker is rural land is hard. That's true for vanilla bank lending. It's less true for the broader lending market. Regional lenders, rural bank divisions, and some of the mutual banks have more appetite for rural land than the Big Four. Bendigo Bank has genuine exposure to regional agricultural land. Bank of Queensland has regional divisions that understand rural valuations. Rural Finance, now operating under Agriculture Victoria, provides specialist finance for agricultural land with pathways that don't exist in a standard bank product guide. This doesn't mean you'll get 90% LVR on a bare block. You won't. But the idea that rural land financing is impossible is a myth that mostly exists in the minds of people who've never tried. If you're buying rural land with the intention of eventually building or subdividing, there's another pathway worth knowing about. Construction finance on rural land is handled differently to construction on residential. The land doesn't qualify as residential security, so the loan structure shifts. An experienced rural lending broker, not a general mortgage broker, but someone who specifically does rural and ag finance, is genuinely worth the time to find. The difference between the right loan structure and the wrong one on a rural land purchase can be tens of thousands of dollars over the life of the deal. Fourth, the income angles most people don't look for. Bare rural land doesn't have to be dead weight while you hold it. There are multiple income streams available on rural land in Victoria that owners consistently underuse or don't know about. Agistment is the simplest. You're effectively renting your paddock to someone else's livestock. It's not glamorous, but it generates enough to cover rates and contribute to holding costs. Carbon farming is more interesting. The Australian government's ERF, Emissions Reduction Fund, pays landowners per tonne of carbon stored through vegetation management or soil carbon projects. If you're holding an SMSF or an investment portfolio with land, shares, or multiple asset types, Sharesight makes tracking your real returns genuinely simple. It handles dividends, franking credits, and tax reporting automatically. One of the most useful tools for self-directed Australian investors. Link in the show notes. A well-structured carbon project on a rural Victorian block can generate meaningful passive income over a 15 to 25-year project period, and the credits are sold to businesses that are legally required to offset their emissions. The market for Australian carbon credit units has been volatile. They hit over $57 a tonne before pulling back. But the structural demand for offsets is only going one direction as net zero commitments lock in. Biodiversity credits are a newer and less mature market, but Victoria is actively building its bushbroker scheme, which allows landowners to generate credits by protecting and enhancing native vegetation. These are not get-rich-quick mechanisms. They're legitimate long-term yield generators on land that would otherwise be sitting empty. Now let's get specifically Australian about this, because there are schemes and programs that apply directly to regional Victoria that most people buying land have never heard of. The Regional Jobs and Infrastructure Fund in Victoria has directed money into regional towns in ways that directly affect land values. When a regional town gets a hospital upgrade, a university campus expansion, or a transport link improvement, the surrounding land reprices. Not immediately, that's the window, but reliably. Shepparton got its hospital redevelopment. Ballarat's gotten significant transport investment. The towns currently in the queue for major infrastructure decisions include parts of the Goulburn Valley and the Loddon region. Infrastructure investment is public information. Planning applications are public information. If you're spending 2 minutes on a regional town's council website to see what's been submitted and approved in the last 12 months, you're doing more research than 90% of the people buying there. The regional first homeowner grant in Victoria still pays $10,000 on top of the standard first homeowner grant for purchases or builds in regional areas. That's available on properties up to $750,000. If you're buying a rural residential block and intending to build, that money exists and it stacks. The stamp duty concession for first home buyers on properties under $600,000 is also available in regional Victoria. And for regional purchases between $600,000 and $750,000, there's a partial concession. These don't move the needle on $1 million land deal, but on a $400,000 regional block, they absolutely matter. The First Home Guarantee Scheme, where the federal government acts as guarantor so you don't need a full 20% deposit, now has a regional buyer stream. The Regional Home Guarantee specifically targets purchases and first builds in regional areas and allows eligible buyers to get in with as little as 5% deposit. On rural land with an intended dwelling, eligibility depends on the specifics of the title and zoning, but it's worth checking because the answer isn't always no. Here's the thing about regional Victorian land in 2026. It is not a secret, but it is underanalysed. The people who are doing well in this market are not doing anything exotic. They're reading planning documents that are public. They're talking to councils that will take a phone call. They're using rural finance brokers who know the product. They're looking for income streams that aren't just the house on the block. And they're buying in towns where the infrastructure conversation has started, but the price discovery hasn't finished. The comparison to 2012 Brisbane isn't casual. Brisbane regional land in that period was genuinely cheap, genuinely misunderstood, and genuinely rewarding for people who looked past the conventional wisdom that said real money is in Sydney. Regional Victoria is not Brisbane. The dynamics are different, but the underlying pattern, late pricing, genuine demand drivers, and mainstream investor distraction elsewhere, that pattern rhymes. The worst thing you can do is spend 6 months watching the market and then buy at the top because you watched long enough to see everyone else buy first. The planning documents are on the council websites. The zone maps are on the Planning Maps online tool, free right now. The infrastructure announcements are in the regional newspapers nobody reads. This information is not locked behind a paywall or a subscription or a buyer's agent's retainer. Go look at it, form a view, then decide. Hidden yield is about finding the gap between what most people know and what the money actually does. Regional Victorian land is one of the clearest gaps in the Australian market right now. That gap will not be open forever. Check the links in the show notes for the Planning Maps online tool and the Victorian Government's Bushbroker scheme. If this landed for you, share it with one person who's thinking about property and has never considered going past the ring road. That's how hidden yield grows. One genuinely useful share at a time. Quick reminder, everything you just heard is general information only, not personal financial advice. It doesn't take into account your personal circumstances, objectives, or financial situation. Always chat to a qualified, licensed professional before making any financial decisions. Now go get more. hiddenyield.com.au